Welcome to another episode of the Grid Buzz podcast, where I will be doing driver ratings for the Imola GP. Imola was pretty action-packed this year. We talked about it during the race review, but typically Imola is more of a qualifying GP. That was not the case at all. There was quite a lot of overtakes. There was a lot of action. Maybe that was because of the slightly softer tire compounds going all the way down to the C6 and up through the C4. It was definitely because of the VSC and the full safety car that added a little bit in. I saw one thing about there being some headwinds potentially on the back straight into turn one, which made the DRS effect a little bit more powerful as well. But all of these things came together to give a really exciting Imola GP. And with that, we will dive into our driver rating. So to kick it off with Sauber, we will go into Gabriel Bortoleto. Overall, I am giving him a 6 for the weekend. He's in a Sauber, so it's really hard, both being a rookie and being in the worst car on the grid. It's really hard to do much, but he has been pretty quiet, obviously, the whole season. Nothing really that I can remember being too exciting, and that was a little bit more of that this weekend. He did get a little bit lucky with the red flag and the weird mistiming on that red flag that led to Ollie Behrman not actually making it into Q2. And so he got a surprise promotion into Q2, which I would say as a rookie driver in a Sauber is definitely some bonus points, but he wasn't really able to convert that into anything noteworthy, starting P14, finishing P18 overall, kind of where you would expect a Sauber to finish at this point. But yeah, pretty quiet weekend from Bortoleto. Moving into Nico Hülkenberg. Consistently the last few years, Nico, I feel, has been in an underperforming car, but has generally outperformed that underperforming car. And I think that was another instance of this weekend, having started P17, moving up 5 places and finishing P12. Nothing too crazy happened with Hülkenberg throughout the race. Probably the most exciting thing that happened with Hülkenberg was more with Yuki when he pulled that switchback overtake after the safety car at the end of the race. So nothing really super noteworthy of Hülkenberg's race, but it was quiet. It was effective. He gained 5 positions. He finished P12. Not a bad place to be given, he's in the tractor of the grid, which is Kick Sauber. Moving down into Alpine. Pierre Gasly, we will give him a 6 for this GP. So this actually looked like it was going to be a little bit more of an exciting weekend. Qualifying P9, had a lot of opportunity kind of laid out, looked good, making it into Q3 in the Alpine. Stars were aligned. Qualifying GP, where qualifying, typically matters a lot. Like I said, didn't typically pan out that way this weekend, but that's normally how the Imola GP goes. But unfortunately, made a mistake on lap 1, trying to fight with Leclerc, swung wide, ended up in the gravel. A couple people overtook, lost some positions, and just never really rebounded from that mistake and ended up finishing P14. So it's a weekend of what could have been for Gasly. Maybe there was some points in store, but that's not how it played out. So we are giving him a 6. Moving over into Franco Colapinto. So I'm giving him a 5 on the weekend. A bit interesting, right? He ends up making it into Q2 on time, but does, kind of crash at the end, causing the red flag. One of the things that Flavio said only a few hours before was that I've given Franco a couple instructions, and one is he has to be quick, and 2, he can't crash the car. And then, of course, he goes and crashes the car, which he did a little bit of last season, and looks like he picked up where he left off there. It is what it is. He didn't have preseason testing. He's coming in at a track like Imola, which, isn't necessarily the easiest track. It's a bit narrow, not a lot of time in seat, had some time last year, but he's basically a rookie. All of those things kind of coming together. But yeah, he also did receive a 1-place grid penalty for a pit lane infringement. So technically he qualified P15, but he started P16, ended up finishing P16. So overall, a pretty quiet weekend other than the crash that happened. And that's definitely not the thing that you want to have as the memorable moment of a weekend, as a crash during qualifying. So we'll give him some grace because it's his first race back, but Franco Colapinto rolling with a 5. Moving over into the Racing Bulls, Liam Lawson. What a just underwhelming performance this year from Liam Lawson. Honestly, he looked really good to me last year. Like, from what I remember, unless I'm misremembering, like, he seemed to be outperforming Yuki Tsunoda in the Racing Bull. There was that race when he outqualified not only Yuki, but both the Red Bull drivers. It seemed like he had a lot of promise, and I don't know what happened. I don't know if Red Bull being in that seat just absolutely wrecked his confidence, put him in a weird headspace. I'm not sure, but, beginning of the season, running at P20 with all the races, moving over into the Racing Bulls where you thought he was going to rebound and be able to kind of show some of the performance that he had last year. And then that just not playing out at all. Isaac Hadjar, his rookie teammate, consistently outperforming him. Just overall, not a great look. But, on the weekend, he qualified P15. He did move up one spot due to Franco's pit lane infringement. And then he did gain one position during the race and finished P14. But, obviously, given how well Isaac performed on the race, not a great weekend again for Liam Lawson. He's got to figure out something there, or I don't think he's going to have a seat next season. But moving over to Isaac Hadjar, who has arguably been the rookie of the season. Antonelli arguably also could be the rookie of the season as well, but Antonelli's in quite a bit better of a team and in a better car, but either way, these are the kind of two pinnacles to look to for rookies this season. He qualified P9 and was able to hold that and finish getting some points. So overall, really, really solid weekend for Isaac Hadjar. He was running in the top 5 at one stage as well. So we are giving him a 9. Moving into Fernando Alonso, the unluckiest driver in the world, to put it in his words over the team radio last weekend. He qualified an insane P5. I don't know. I don't think anybody would have saw that coming. Being able to put it up into the top of the grid overall looked like he was going to be on pace for a pretty solid weekend, which is not something that, Aston has typically been known for over the course of this season so far. But from a strategy perspective, it just all fell apart in the race, unfortunately. Not a great strategy, on the kind of the suboptimal 2-stop strategy there. Just was not able to kind of convert on that. Got caught out by, the VSCs and the safety cars. He's not the only one who got caught out there. There's definitely other drivers who got caught out like Ferrari, but he is one of them, and then ended up falling back to finish at P11, so just outside of the points, which is super unfortunate because I would have loved to see Alonso score some points this weekend. But overall, I am actually giving him an 8 because I think he drove really well this weekend. He qualified really well. He would have scored points had it not been for, just a little bit of a botched strategy and ill-timed VSCs and safety cars. So giving Alonso an 8. Moving over to Lance Stroll, I am giving him a 7. He qualified a very strong P8, only a couple spots back from Alonso, but both of them in the top 10, squeezing through on those medium tires. But similar thing to Alonso, was not able to kind of capitalize on the race strategy. It was a bit suboptimal, and he did fall 7 positions, so significantly more than Alonso, back to P15. But I am giving him a 7 because, putting the car P8 to begin with was a pretty outstanding feat, given that, Aston Martin has not been that good this year. So I do think it was a relatively good drive for Lance. And I do think, P12 to P15 is probably the sweet spot for that car anyway. And he landed in that on top of but has the strong qualifying to kind of precede that. And once again, the race strategy didn't help him much here. So I am giving Stroll a 7 on the weekend. Moving over into Esteban Ocon. What an underwhelming weekend that was. Honestly, I think Esteban Ocon has had a pretty underwhelming season and a pretty surprising, contrast in performance against his rookie teammate Oliver Behrman. You would think, race winner, a lot more years under his belt, all of those things, that he should be outperforming by quite a bit, and that just has not been the case. He did qualify P18, which, Haas has been pretty inconsistent this year, to be fair. Some tracks they've looked decent on, some tracks they have not looked good at all on. This is one of the tracks that they did not look good on. Oliver didn't look that great either, but you would think that Ocon would perform at a little bit higher of a level, qualifying P18 and unfortunately DNFing, which is not necessarily his fault, but overall, a very, very underwhelming performance and weekend for Ocon. So we are giving him a 4. Moving over to Behrman, similar story, qualified P19, but I don't think that was necessarily his fault. He had the pace to get into Q2. There was that ill-timed red flag. There was also like that weird synchronization issue where the red flag was deployed late on the signals that were on the side of the track, the red flashing signals. So I don't know. It's kind of weird that happened. I can't believe that, in the age that we're on, that you could just have a signal come out a couple seconds late like that. But at the end of the day, the red flag was flown, so his time did not count, and he was knocked out of Q1, unfortunately, qualifying P19. From there, it didn't get a whole lot better. He gained 2 positions during the race. He did move up to P17, but it just, once again, kind of a low-key weekend for Haas and Behrman, and so we are giving him a 5. Moving over to Williams, very exciting weekend for that team. We will start off with Carlos Sainz, who is getting an 8. He qualified a blinding fast P6 in the Williams, had a pretty good race strategy at first where he was going to be on a 1-stop, wanted to stay on the 1-stop. There was a little bit of a radio message about that, but unfortunately ended up on a 2-stop. And that is where the race started to fall apart a little bit for Carlos Sainz. I think there was definitely more in the cards for him during this race, but unfortunately, that 2-stop strategy just did not pan out at all for him. And he ended up dropping 2 positions and finishing P8 with some battles with Tsunoda that happened and kind of hindered him a little bit as well. So really unfortunate. He's not the only one that was kind of impacted by poor strategy, safety cars, VSCs, but he was one of them. I don't want to ding him too much for that because I do think it was a pretty good drive and great weekend overall, putting those factors aside, but we are giving him an 8. Moving over to his teammate, Alex Albon, who I think didn't look to be as fast as Carlos Sainz this weekend, although did look to be still very fast in that Williams, but did have a little bit better strategy, did get a little bit more lucky, but was able to capitalize on that luck over the course of the weekend. He did qualify an impressive P7, so Williams backing each other up at P6 and P7, which is great to see. And then during the race, there was a pretty perfectly timed VSC, which did allow for an optimal pit strategy, kind of pushing him up front, allowing him to then be on fresher tires and go take the fight to the Ferraris later on in the race, specifically with that Leclerc incident. Very unfortunate. I'm bummed to see it. It did unfortunately also not pan out that well for Albon either, because by Leclerc pushing him off, it did allow Hamilton up the inside. So, what could have been a P4, maybe in a P, is just going to be what could have been for Albon. But overall, really solid drive, great qualifying, for the most part capitalized on everything that he could, other than, that one battle with Leclerc. So we're giving Albon a 9 for the weekend. Moving down into my boys, Ferrari, home GP at Imola. Unfortunately, maybe not the showing that you would like to see at the home GP at Imola, but sometimes that happens. So kicking it off with Leclerc, I'm giving him a 7 on the weekend. I think this is another instance of what could have been. I think he easily could have got a higher rating if things just fell his way a little bit better, but they didn't. Qualified P11, which is abysmal in the Ferrari, not a great qualifying at all. Did kind of make a good strategy decision, sort of, or would have been, could have been, with the early stop to get out of that DRS train and was making up ground. Unfortunate timing with the VSC. Like I said in the race review, I think that they should not have repitted in the VSC. I think they should have stayed out, but they did decide to pit during the VSC, which kind of, made it so that he would have a really long stint on the back end, which did not play out, obviously, as we saw, especially with the full safety car coming back into play, which essentially gave away all of the advantage that he had made up. He gave up a lot of the advantage by repitting in the VSC, and then it made it even worse with the full safety car, because then he's on old tires, long stint. Some people threw on fresher tires and were able to go take the battle to him. Like I said in the race review, I would have liked to see him come in and take those fresh softs, even though it would have been a long stint, or looked like it could have been a long stint on those fresh softs. I would have liked to see that over the hards. I did see a clip since I did the race review. I didn't realize that he also partially didn't come into the pits was because Hamilton pulled in front of him, and so he didn't want to double stack. I thought Ferrari originally just told him to stay out because they didn't want him to take the softs because they thought it was too long to be on the softs. It was a combination of both of those factors, but both of them led to him not coming in to take the C6s, and that unfortunately did not pan out, with him starting P11, making up some positions. Coulda, shoulda, coulda, maybe would have been a P3 if everything fell in the cards, but unfortunately finished at a P6, and that's why we are giving him a 7 on the weekend. Moving over into Hamilton, also a abysmal qualifying at P12. I also didn't think that Hamilton necessarily looked like he had significant pace throughout the weekend. Charles always looked like the faster driver. Hamilton looked like he had, maybe some average pace, but, the VSC and the safety car and all of that, while it didn't pan out for Leclerc, it did fall into the hands of Hamilton a lot better. So at least one of the Ferrari boys came up on it. With that, while I do think that his pace was maybe a little bit average, he took advantage of the situations that were presented to him. If the race was a couple laps longer, I said this during the race review, I think he had a shot at P3 because Oscar kind of fell into a similar situation with the safety cars. I think he could have gone and taken the fight to him and, gotten on the podium, which would have been great to see. But, the race ended when the race ended, and that didn't happen. And a P4 is still a very good finish for Hamilton, given where he has performed at through the rest of the season. Getting at least a P4 in front of their home crowd at Imola, the Tifosi, was, I think, overall a highlight of the weekend at least. So we are giving Hamilton an 8 because he took advantage of the situations that were presented to him, and he did all that he could do with the cards that were dealt. So Hamilton gets an 8 on the weekend. And moving over to George Russell at Mercedes, I'm going to give him a 7. I know that, it seems like that car is not great on tire management at certain tracks in certain temperatures, which I think is another case of that this weekend. He qualified P3, so looked really, really quick, looked like he could have been on to a good weekend, but ended up finishing P7. P7 I don't think is that great for that Mercedes. Also, he was pretty clearly slower than a lot of the cars on the track through a number of points in the race. At the beginning of the race, when you looked, he had like a 4 or 5 car kind of DRS train where he was backing everybody up into each other and no one could pass. And he was in cars that were definitely should have been slower than him, were kind of right up on his rear bumper as a result. So overall, I don't think the pace was that good. Yes, there was some kind of overheating on the rear axle, but I do think it's an underwhelming performance by Russell and, to be honest, Mercedes as a whole on the weekend. And so we are giving him a 7. Moving over to Antonelli, his first time at his home GP. He drove practice last year and wadded it up into the wall, and there's that whole story. Unfortunately, another underwhelming kind of home showing for Antonelli, qualifying P13, which is not great, especially considering his teammate qualified P3. That car definitely should have been able to make it into Q3 during the weekend, but that's not how it panned out. So underwhelming qualifying experience from Antonelli. Another kind of highlights at certain points in the race was running at P6 at a certain point. Had some good battles with Hamilton, but overall ended up DNFing on the race on lap 44. So very underwhelming home GP for Antonelli. Super unfortunate that, both times that he showed up in the last couple years to his home GP, it hasn't exactly gone in his favor. But with that, a very average weekend. And so we are giving him a 5. Moving over to Yuki Tsunoda, wadding it up into the wall in Q1. Obviously not what he needed to do there. So he's starting from the pit lane. He did finish P10 in the points, which is pretty good considering he started from the pit lane, but he was heavily aided by the VSCs and the safety cars, which, kind of bunched, especially the full safety car, which bunched the field back up and gave him the opportunity to move back into the points. Had that not happened, I don't think he would have made his way up to P10. He did have that nice switchback overtake on Hülkenberg, but he also was not able to fend off Piastri for very long. He made that mistake that allowed Piastri to overtake him in the DRS zone. I would have liked to see him, put up a bit of a better defense there in case Piastri did have the pace to take the fight to Max Verstappen. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be an issue, but it could have been at that stage of the race. So I am going to give Yuki a 6 on the weekend because I do think it was a pretty underwhelming experience, other than the fact that he did at least kind of recover it by getting back to P10 and scoring some points. Moving over to Max Verstappen, though, like I said, probably the overtake of the season so far, turn 1, lap 1, caught Piastri absolutely sleeping at the wheel, took advantage, was an absolute, dangerous send. That could have easily ended up in both of them into each other, both their races out, but it didn't. And so because it didn't, we are going to applaud that overtake, and then really just ran away with it for the remainder of the race. A lot of people were struggling with their tires at the beginning of the race, taking early pit stops. He was able to extend and make sure that those tires were kept in a window that was manageable. He did have the fresh air out front, which helps there, but overall, essentially a perfectly executed weekend other than qualifying P2. But he only missed out on P1 by literal thousandths of a second. I also don't think that Red Bull is as fast as the McLaren, so to put it ahead of Norris and only be thousandths off of Piastri in qualifying, I do think is a big win. That was maybe his only fault on the weekend. Everything else was flawlessly executed, as we know Max does. Moving over to the McLaren boys, though, we will start out with Oscar Piastri. So qualified P, looked like he was going to be on track for another really strong weekend, strong and consistent weekend like he has the last few races. Not that he didn't have a strong weekend. He still ended up on the podium, but, a little bit underwhelming given his recent experience, and string of top of the podium finishes, and also being in that McLaren and, how fast that car is. The expectations and the bar for performance is pretty high here. He did get caught sleeping on turn 1. It was a very late, very far back lunge that I don't think he would have expected, and he had George Russell up the inside as a serious threat, which he had to fend off. So you can't blame it all on him, but at the end of the day, it did happen. Was caught out with the VSCs and the full safety car, similar to Leclerc and some other drivers as well. So that wasn't necessarily his fault, and kind of gave Norris P2 over him. At the end of the day, a podium finish isn't bad, but given all the factors together, just not the weekend that he's had through a majority of the season. So I am giving him an 8. Moving over to Norris, I'm going to give him an 8 as well. He did finish P2, but, qualifying P4 behind his teammate Piastri. He did get, a little bit lucky, I think, during the race with the VSC and the full safety cars, and, kind of putting Piastri down and giving him a chance to be, especially on the full safety car restart, on fresher tires behind Piastri, who was on old tires and really lacking pace. He did have a good overtake on George Russell at the beginning of the race to make sure that he wasn't getting kind of held up in that train. So that was a, I guess, highlight moment for Norris. But overall, with his experience and how long he's been in F1 at this point, and being in the car, which is McLaren this season, which is, as we all know, a very fast car. I don't know, finishing P2, but finishing P2 because I think he got a little bit of luck. You can't necessarily blame him for it. Like I said, with Hamilton, I think Hamilton got lucky as well and kind of capitalized on it. But, Hamilton's not in as fast of a car, and I don't think the expectations are as high. He's on, the back of his career, whereas Lando's at the top of his career. I think there's a lot of factors that come in here, but giving Lando in 8 as well. Those are your driver ratings for the Imola GP, and we've got the Monaco GP coming up this weekend, so make sure that you tune into the channel for, once again, race predictions, race reviews, driver ratings, and we will definitely be doing some fashion reviews for Monaco as well. So I will see you all later.